been in the last couple of seminars, and where we're going also for the next seminar. And so it's I'll be backbenching a little bit, as we see here.
Simon, how have the seminars been going so far? I'm sure they've been quite different in character, each one of them.
Yeah, I don't understand your question.
Yeah, it's not a clear question. Is this your first year leading the seminars, putting them together?
Yeah, it is my first year. Yeah, since I began to coordinate this seminar since February, I think. Yeah, and it will end on December.
Am I right?
But
Excuse me.
It is a very interesting experience, and I think it may help me to more networking, to have to network with scholars and people from other countries and so on.
Terrific.
And I think we will proceed. I will introduce you. Maybe I will just remind people about what we did the last since February, and after that I will introduce you. I will introduce what you did, your work, and after that I will let you begin your presentation.
Great.
Is it okay for you?
Yes.
Yeah.
My only request is that you keep it as crisp as possible. I find that when I go to talks,
Yeah.
sometimes people go on and on about introducing people, and it cuts into the talk and then the audience conversation. And that's the most important part for me, is getting to the audience.
Yeah.
Interaction. That's what I.
Interaction. Yeah.
Yeah. Simon, am I correct to assume that this is a highly interdisciplinary audience? So it's going to be everything from philosophers to sociologists, if there are people, if anybody shows up. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
I understand how, yes, how unsure we can be about getting audiences for anything these days. But.
So let's begin. Okay. Hello, and welcome to all those who are here with us as we continue our 2021 lecture series in health ethics with the sixth seminar already. My name is Abdul Simon Senghor, and I am a postdoctoral researcher at the Pragmatic Health Ethics Research Unit based at the ERCM. I'm coordinating this series of conferences, and I have the honor of acting as moderator today. Since the beginning of our conference series, a rich debate on human flourishing has taken place thanks to the intervention of confirmed experts. Marie-Rose Charest made us aware of that well-being involves taking care of oneself in order to be able to open up to others and show empathy. Carol Reef taught us that well-being is fundamental to staying healthy. Cordia Barnes and Kevin Rodriguez showed that the denial of systemic racism is detrimental to the well-being of individuals. Magdalene Sue and Nancy Golui-Magui addressed the ethical challenge of and the vision of wellness specific to First Nations. Alain Ehrenberg made the link between human flourishing and autonomy as a form of action and the capacity of the individual to act in spite of his mental health problems. We are honored to have Dr. Erik Parens here today to talk about human flourishing from a different perspective. In this sixth conference, he will talk about how comprehension and respect of others foster human flourishing. Erik Parens is a senior research scholar at the Hastings Center, a leading bioethics research institute in Garrison, New York. He has led research projects on diverse issues, including the disability community critique of prenatal genetic testing, the use of surgery to normalize the appearance of children with atypical anatomies, and on the prospect of using genomics to make predictions about complex behavioral and social outcomes. Most pertinent to his event, he is the author of Shaping Ourselves on Technology, Flourishing, and a Habit of Thinking, and is an editor of Human Flourishing in an Age of Gene Editing. Thank you again, Dr. Parens. I let you begin your presentation.
Dr. Senghor, thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's an honor to be with all of you. I can see 4 of you today. A lovely thing about Zoom is that I don't have to travel. The downside, of course, is that I can't see people and can't respond during the course of my remarks, but I am very eager to be in conversation after the remarks. So the title of the talk is just a little bit different from what was advertised, but I hope you'll discover in the end that the spirit lives up to the title. I want to be forthright about the fact that the argument I'm going to present is very much under construction. The argument, boils down to, if we seek to exhibit care for persons, we need to respect them as persons. To show respect, we need to aspire to comprehend persons in depth, and to comprehend persons in depth, it can help to use this metaphor of binocular vision or binocularity. So that's sort of the bigger argument that I'm interested in. I'm going to focus today on that last part, on explicating the metaphor of binocular vision. So the plan is to tell you more about what I mean by the metaphor of binocular vision. I want to emphasize that I think we are all impaired with respect to this ideal of binocular vision. I mean that both metaphorically and literally. I want to move then from the metaphor of binocular vision to drilling down and talking about what I mean when I say that we have to be seen as objects. And I'm going to be emphasizing how seeing us as objects will push us towards seeing us as subjects. And then finally, I will drill down a little more with this idea of persons as subjects and suggest some ways in which seeing us as subjects can push us towards seeing ourselves as objects. So first, to try to unpack this metaphor of binocular vision, this is a representation of someone seeing from above. So down here you see the visual cortex, here you see eyes and between a nose, and the idea the key idea here is that the brain takes in two slightly different sets of information, takes in this information, it takes in this information, and it puts those two sets of information together to perceive depth in the visual field. So literally, the brain integrates different sets of information about a scene in order to perceive depth. And what I want to suggest is this metaphorical sense of binocularity, where our minds have to integrate significantly different sets of information about the same phenomenon, in this case, the person, to comprehend persons in depth. I first encountered the metaphor of binocular vision in the work of Jonathan Glover. He's by no means the first person to suggest a metaphor like this, but he's the person who introduced me to it. Again, the simple idea is that to comprehend persons in depth, we've got to see them as objects and as subjects. As objects, each of us, our behaviors and our experiences admit of explanation. We could give a very long causal account, at least in principle we could, about why the words coming out of my mouth at this moment are coming out as they are. And we are subjects. To understand a subject requires understanding. To understand a subject's experience requires understanding, which is a different kettle of fish from explaining why they have the experience. As you all know, we use the natural and social sciences to explain why people behave the way they do, why they have the experiences they do. As subjects, when we seek to understand what their experience is like for them, one tool we can use is the humanities. Even more crucially, what we have to use is our capacity to listen to subjects as they tell us what it is like to be them. As objects, from the point of view of the universe, we are without value. Each of us as a subject is of infinite value to ourselves and those that love us, who love us. Now, I said before that this metaphor of binocular vision I got from Jonathan Glover. Indeed, I did. If I'm making any innovation at all with his metaphor, what I want to emphasize is this idea that binocularity is an aspiration. We can no more see persons as objects and as subjects at the same time than we can see this figure as a duck looking left and the rabbit looking right at one time. If we want to see it as a duck that's looking left, we can do that easily enough. If we want to see it as a rabbit, and by the way, you see the ears and eyes of the rabbit, and then I think it's harder for people to see the rabbit, to see the rabbit. If we want to see the rabbit looking right, we have to shift our attention. And in that sense, we're always, I believe, going to have to oscillate between seeing persons as objects and subjects. And with regard to this ideal of binocular vision, I want to suggest we are all impaired. None of us can see both at once. So now I want to drill down with this idea of seeing persons as objects. The question marks there are supposed to convey that I know that the suggestion that we ought to see people as objects sometimes, I understand the way in which that sounds utterly bizarre. Isn't that exactly the opposite of what we're supposed to be doing with respect to persons? So I'm hoping to answer that rhetorical question in time. So when I say we're objects, all I really mean is that all human experience can, in principle, be explained by genetic or biological and environmental or social determinants. And when I say in principle, I mean, I don't see any time soon when anybody's going to be able to do anything remotely like explain why each of us has the experiences we have. But I am eager to acknowledge that in principle, the sciences can do that. And so what I am signing on to here is what some philosophers will notice or would be inclined to call some form of non-reductive materialism. What do I mean by that? Really, what I mean is I don't think that in order to explain our behaviors or why we have the experiences we have, we need to invoke anything like an extra natural cause. So what I want to do is reject the kinds of explanations of experience and behavior that one might find, for example, and the examples are many, sort of extra natural cause or determinant that one might find in Plato, who invokes an immaterial, immortal soul to explain how it is that experience can emerge out of bodies. I am rejecting that. And I want to make absolutely clear that in saying that we can explain our experiences, I do not want to explain away our experiences. And frankly, it seems to me that some philosophers under the influence of neuroscience and neuroscientists who are philosophizing sometimes speak as if our experience is nothing more than, as Francis Crick says here, a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. For my money, Crick and Plato are actually closely related, and they're both making mistakes I don't want to make. I don't want to have to import anything extra natural, and I don't want to exclude the significance or meaningfulness of experience in the way that folks like Crick sometimes can at least sound like they intend to do. So, digging a little more into this idea that as objects, we can be explained in terms of genetic and environmental determinants. I feel compelled to do some clarification of an idea that in some ways might seem banal, in some ways might seem distressing. I want to be clear about what I mean. So This example that I'm going to use comes from Richard Lewontin in the 70s. So imagine that you have a bag of seed, corn seed, and it hasn't been genetically modified. It's sort of like human beings, we grow to different heights because we grow out of different seeds. You take the corn and you put it into a planter of the sort you see here, and you expose those seeds to uniformly good lighting, uniformly good soil, water, and air. You notice that the corn grows to different heights because we've stipulated that the environment is uniformly good for all of these plants. We can infer that the phenotypic or observed differences that are plain on this slide can be attributed to genetic differences, right? We've stipulated environmental is uniform, so the differences we see have to be due to genetics. And by the way, in this case, the heritability of the height of the corn is 100%. Now, here's a second group. You go to your bag of corn seed, you take it, throw it into a different planter, and in this case, you give it uniformly bad lighting, uniformly bad soil, uniformly bad water, uniformly bad air. Now, once again, because they're different seeds, because they've got different genomes, they're going to grow to different heights. I've stipulated that the environmental conditions for each one of those plants is the same. So once again, we can assert that the heritability of the height of the corn here is 100%. One of the messages here is that genes and environments both matter. One is that we shouldn't be snookered by heritability estimates, which are a measure of how much of the observed diversity is due to genetic diversity in a particular environment. Now, this point was made a very long time ago by, among others, W.E.B. Du Bois, who in 1906 found himself having to argue that if you want to understand why the average health outcomes for Negro Americans and white Americans was different, you would be a fool to be looking at genetic differences. Plainly, you would be looking at environmental differences. Now, I want to go a little further with this idea that through the object lens, genetic and environmental differences can matter. So according to the first law of behavioral genetics, first articulated by Erik Turkheimer, based on family and twin studies, all observed behaviors, all human experiences are partly heritable. Genetic differences are helping to explain why it is that some people are prone to schizophrenia and some are more prone, some are less prone. Genetic differences can help to explain drug abuse, emotional intelligence, general intelligence, religiosity, longevity. I take this as a given. And if anybody wants to talk about the logic of twin, family, and adoption studies, I would be happy to do that a little later. It seems to be important to notice that when we recognize that genetic differences are helping to explain all observed differences, we don't need to be alarmed. The whole idea of twin and family studies arose in the 1960s and 70s, and it was very important in establishing a very important fact, and that is that if you want to explain something like schizophrenia or autism, you should stop blaming mothers. You should stop blaming environments for those conditions. It's not that genetics explains all of schizophrenia and autism. It's that genetics is part of the story, part of the explanation in a way that hadn't been appreciated earlier. And of course, to say that genetic differences might help to explain all observed differences does not mean by any stretch of the imagination that genetic differences determine what we observe. It means they're part of a complicated story. And I won't dwell on this point within brackets, which is that it's been enormously difficult for geneticists to go from establishing that genetic differences are making a difference to finding anything interesting out about which genetic differences are making a difference. Classical genetics was a huge success so far, molecular genetics much less so. Again, perhaps that's controversial. I'm delighted to talk about it later. A corollary of the first law of behavioral genetics I want to suggest is what we might call the first law of social science, which is, again, of course, that environments help to explain all observed behaviors, from schizophrenia to longevity. And among those environmental determinants or social determinants are ones that I suspect this group has been talking about a great deal this year and is deeply familiar with. Our knowledge of the social determinants of health, the environmental determinants of health is now vast and incontrovertible. One of the, excuse me again, indeed, there are sociologists, biosociologists like Bridget Gooseby, who are doing beautiful work to show how social determinants like racism get under the skin and have biological effects. Now, I have in parentheses this statement because, frankly, as I admitted at the start, I'm working how to talk about some of this out. And I would love criticisms of this assertion later, or constructive criticisms, that is. So I wonder if I can generalize and say that environmental determinants are going to loom very large if we're trying to explain group differences, like why on average one group lives longer than the other. I want to go out on a limb for a moment anyway, at least for today, and say that genetic determinants can, they don't always have to by any stretch, can loom large in explaining individual differences not between groups, but between individuals. And so when I say that, what I have in mind is thinking through the kind of causal explanation of schizophrenia that is being offered here by Irving Gottesman and his colleagues, the late Irv Gottesman and his colleagues. I understand that this is a rather complicated slide, or it looks to be, but it's rather simple in the idea. You can see this horizontal plane and a vertical plane. You can call this horizontal plane the floor. What is being represented here is genetic variants are exerting influence from the bottom, as it were. And they are interacting with environments, which can be harmful or protective. And of course, people interact over time with those environments. And the simple point is that some people are born with genomes such that no matter how harmful their environment is, they are not going to develop schizophrenia. Whereas there are some people whose genomes are such that if they have a sufficiently harmful environment over time, they will develop schizophrenia. And by the way, this is a subtle graph where schizophrenia is in fact a continuous variable. It's a spectrum, although we're of course not accustomed to thinking of it exactly that way. But the most important point here is that if you're trying to think about individuals and why they exhibit the behaviors and why they have the experiences they do, you're looking through the object lens, and that object lens is going to include this gigantic number of diverse variables that are interacting over time. Everything from genes and hormones to the home environment and social environment. And by emphasizing the fact that being in a harmful environment produces experiences in people that can contribute to their experience of something like schizophrenia or any other kind of experience, what that suggests to us is that we are pushed in the direction of thinking about persons as objects to thinking about them as subjects. What was it like for that person to be exposed to that environment in their past? And finally, I'm getting us to talk about seeing persons as subjects. Again, the thesis here is you want to comprehend persons in depth, you got to see them as objects and as subjects. I want to move, that is, from explaining why we have the experiences we have to trying to understand the experiences that we have for the sake of showing respect and exhibiting care. Moving from why do we have experience to what is it like to have it? What does it mean to have it? And I want to suggest that the kind of understanding I'm saying is needed entails recognizing many things. Among them, it requires that we presume that persons are the authority on their experience. And I'm going to explain to you shortly why I say presumed. I want to remember what is equally obvious, which is that others' experience is going to be similar to ours and radically different, both. And I'm trying to push this idea that we can't respect others without seeking to understand them, and that we can't care for others without seeking to respect them. So I mentioned earlier that different from when seen through the object lens and used in the sciences, when we're looking through the subject lens and trying to understand people, one of the things that we can do is use the humanities. That is, one way to cultivate an ability to understand our experience of others is to engage with the meaning of texts that others have produced, whether they be poems, novels, plays, or memoirs, or movies, videos. I was going to say Instagrams. I don't know about Instagrams, but I so. That's what we in the humanities do, is we interpret texts. If, for example, you want to understand something about the experience of love, you might consult the poetry of Nikki Giovanni. I should have probably said loves, because she talks quite beautifully about many kinds of loves. Loves for an individual, loves for, in her case, Black people, love for nature. If you want to think about your own experience of love, you might be interested to consult hers. If you want to understand something about what it is like for another to have grief, you might consult the text of Joan Didion and her wonderful, difficult, important memoir, The Year of Magical Thinking. If you want to understand something about what it is like to experience empathy, you might consult Dostoevsky's The Brothers K. In particular, you might think about the behavior and experience of Alyosha. If you want to understand something about the experience of regret, you might reflect on Greta Conroy's experience in Joyce's story, The Dead. If you want to understand something about the experience of rage, you might consult the experience of James Baldwin, as he expresses it in, among other places, The Fire Next Time. Now, imagining what it is like is never going to be enough for respect and care. If you want to understand, if I want to understand, if we want to understand what it is like for someone else to have the experience they are having and to show them the respect they deserve, we have to move from the abstract to the particular. We have to ask that person what it is like for them. And I want to assert that when we go about asking people what it is like for them to be them, what their experience means to them, the default, I believe, always should be to take people at their word. And doing that is always going to require epistemic humility, an acknowledgement of how little we understand about the experience of the other. It's going to require a willingness to be surprised by the other's report of their experience. I trust, I hope that all of you are deeply familiar with the history of the disability justice movement over the last 4 or 5 decades. One of the foundational achievements of disability advocates has been to show, to explain that what their experience, what our experience is like, is different from what temporarily able-bodied people imagine it is like. It is not full of suffering. As my friend and colleague Joel Reynolds would put it, to think that to be disabled is to suffer from the ableist conflation. As Harriet McBride Johnson asserts here, and as myriad other disability activists assert elsewhere, it is entirely possible to flourish in all sorts of bodies. Now, using a phrase of my colleague Rosemary Garland Thompson, people flourish in all sorts of bodies, and there are all sorts of pleasures to be had in all sorts of bodies. And if you don't ask, you will not know. Now, here's where things are going to get a little trickier, and I'm begging you to stick with me. So it's not always going to be enough to only take people at their word. The image there is of a book, one of many memoirs about the experience of anorexia. When we are hearing someone report that they feel fat, even though they weigh 80 pounds, this can be an opportunity to challenge someone to reflect on their report of their own experience. It can be an opportunity to invite someone to think about the genetic and environmental determinants that are bearing down on them and giving rise to a claim that seems to be at odds with what everyone around them observes. The point there was that sometimes, I mean, the default is take people at their word, and I'm recognizing that sometimes seeing through someone's word can be undertaken in the name of showing a person respect. Plainly, I'm treading on very complicated, difficult ice here. I want to get clear about my view that this idea of seeing through somebody else's word, seeing beneath it, seeing what's really going on below the surface. This move has two faces. One of them can be deeply humane, and I was trying to gesture towards that. And one of them can be deeply inhumane. As I was just saying, it can be humane for you to challenge me, to invite me to consider what forces are bearing down on me. And seeing through what I say, or what someone else has said, what someone else says, is terribly fraught with danger. My colleague, Liz Bowen, brought this wonderful history to my attention recently. This is a history by Jonathan Metzl, really of it's a history of how the label schizophrenia has been applied over time. And he describes how in the early part of the previous century, schizophrenia was disproportionately applied to white women. Arising in the 1960s and 70s, which, by the way, just happens to be when all that wonderful work was going on to show that it isn't refrigerator mothers who are responsible for schizophrenia. At the same moment that that wonderful work was going on, this quite horrible thing was happening. And that is that there were psychiatrists who were looking at the behavior of primarily Black men who were protesting inside and outside of prisons. And those psychiatrists, those white psychiatrists, gave those Black men the label of schizophrenia. They were suffering from what was actually called the protest psychosis. This is plainly a horrific example of seeing through what someone says. That is, I say I'm enraged about my situation, and you say, oh, no, you're not. You're suffering from mental illness. The danger couldn't be any greater. We all see that, I hope. I trust. And I just want to oscillate from one way of seeing seeing through to another. I want to go from one face of seeing through to this other face of seeing through. I want to entertain the possibility that seeing through what someone says, what their word is, can be, in some contexts, part of showing respect and care. So this is one part of a very large sculpture, a sculpture made by the Italian sculptor Bernini in the 17th century. And what you can see here is that this is a person whose brain is being bathed in oxytocin, right? This is a person who is experiencing ecstasy. You know very little about what her experience is like for her by knowing that she is experiencing ecstasy. In fact, those lips, that face, belong to this sculpture of Saint Teresa. Saint Teresa of Avila wrote an autobiography in which she explicates her experience of ecstasy. And here's the entire sculpture. And I understand, and I'm sorry that it's hard to read. I've circled two parts of it. This is Teresa in rapture. And this is the angel of God thrusting a sword into her, producing this ecstasy. I believe that, let me go back there. I believe that our default should always be to take people at their word, especially people who report experiences that are foreign from my own. I have no experience of an angel of God visiting me. And as she says in the book, what this was really an experience of sexual intercourse with the Spirit of God, with an angel of God. I don't want to dismiss her experience. And I want to be able to challenge her, or at least, if it were my sister or my daughter who reported that experience, I think I would be inclined to at least temporarily see through the experience, see through her description of the experience. I might inquire about the experience. I might urge her to see a neurologist. And indeed, if there are any neurologists in the group, they've already diagnosed Teresa with frontal lobe epilepsy. The point I want to make here is not only that it's exceedingly difficult to know when to hear, when to take people at their word and when to see through it. There's no algorithm for knowing which. But I also want to make this point that to listen to her as a subject, what are her experiences like for her, can push us towards seeing her as an object. Maybe a tumor impinging on her brain has something to do with this experience. I want to be able to entertain that possibility without dismissing her experience. And so the point I've tried to drive at is that if we want to comprehend persons in depth, we have to be able to oscillate between these two lenses, seeing persons as objects and seeing them as subjects. So in closing, I will just rehearse this predicament I take us to be in. It seems to me that ideally, we would see persons at once as objects and as subjects. And thereby, we would promote our ability to show them respect and care. And what I've tried to, one of the things I've tried to emphasize is that while that might be the ideal, in fact, we are all impaired with respect to this ideal of binocular vision. Instead of seeing two at once, what we need to do is to learn how to oscillate between these lenses, and alas, to oscillate without an algorithm of the sort we all wish we had. So that is a rather, well, it is a predicament. I won't say it's a bleak predicament. It is a predicament. I do hope that, well, I hold anyway, the hope that as you try to negotiate the predicament, you might find the metaphor of binocularity useful. So with that, I will say thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Parens, for your presentation. It gives us another perspective of human flourishing. And now I invite the participants to ask their question using the Q&A function, and Professor Erik Parens will transmit them to you. Thank you.
Merci, Simon. Thank you. Thank you, Eric, for this very nice, interesting, and deep lecture about our lenses and the opportunity of oscillating between our views of ourselves and of others. So now I'm going to turn to the audience to see if we have questions, comments. In the meanwhile, maybe I have one comment or remark or kind of an open-ended question. I'd like to hear you a bit about on the place of dialogue in bioethics, because you really stressed the importance of listening as a kind of a tool or a way of understanding each other or comprehending each other. So what do you think about our bioethics practices and the role of dialogue therein? I know some people have argued for a fundamentally dialogical bioethics or dialogical ethics. Do we need that? Do we need more of that? How do we do that? Maybe if you have comments on maybe, I hesitate to use mainstream bioethics versus or supplemented with more dialogue. And I know your center has been for a very long time, I think, supporting a lot of dialogue.
Thank you, Eric, for that observation and question. Yes, I do indeed think that dialogue is at the heart of a lot of, ought to be at the heart of practice between clinicians and patients, and between bioethicists and bioethicists, and between everybody and everybody, I suppose. It is interesting to me, you're reminding me that when I first came to the Hastings Center, I was, I think, very much influenced by the work of the physician Erik Parens. He was by trade a physician and still is, but he was really, he's really a philosopher at heart. And his argument from the beginning was that physicians were failing to serve patients because they were only seeing them through what I'm calling the object lens, and they were failing to listen. So You're absolutely right to pick up on this idea that the idea of dialogue is at the heart of everything I believe in, and it's actually funny to me that you use that word, which I didn't use word once, and I dismissed Plato's metaphysics, this idea that you need an extranatural soul to explain our experiences. But in fact, my first philosophical love was most surely Plato, and this idea that if you want to make your way closer to the truth of any matter, your only hope is to engage in dialogue. And it doesn't matter who the person is, what their state is, what their status is. When it comes to dialogue, we're all equals and need to listen. So how to promote more of that? Would somebody, I'm terrible at looking at chats. If I'm
Okay, so we do have a first question from the audience, from Matthew Veliket, a lab member, who is asking, is not being able to see object and subject simultaneously an impairment, or is it more a limit of human understanding, akin to the Gestalt switches, for example, between rabbit and duck, as a law and limitation of human perception? So an impairment or limitation?
Oh, I thank you so much for that question, because I've been asking myself that question too. And I'll just be frank about this. Let's see, how frank do I want to be? One of the problems with the metaphor of binocular vision is that it can seem to appeal to some normative conception of how to take in the world. And as somebody who's committed to disability justice, that whole idea makes me nervous. So I'm in a way eager to recognize the way in which, with respect to this ideal, we are all impaired. Can the person who asked me the question push back? Because I would really love, can we hear each other?
Matthew doesn't have access to the mic, but he's part of the meeting we're having this afternoon, so he'll be able to follow up with you and discuss in depth this issue of impairment versus limitation.
So I hope if anybody else in the, yes, I really look forward to that. Thank you for that question.
Okay, but we invite more on that. At the same time, we do have another question from Kay Badington, who's asking, how do you think about not only the viewer using this binocular approach to viewing another, but also the person being viewed having a role in seeing through the initial viewer? Thank you.
Oh, thank you for making me try to get clearer about that. And this actually ties right back to Erik's point about dialogue. This business of seeing the other as subject and object takes place on both sides of the conversation. If we are going to be in conversation, I don't expect you simply to take me at my word. I expect you to challenge me. In fact, we're in the middle of a conversation right now, which entails partly challenges, right? What do you mean by, and what are the intellectual obstacles to your seeing more clearly than you have? So if I understood the point, there was maybe a small criticism, which is I seem to be obsessed with someone in a privileged position observing another. And that's the last thing in the world I want to be guilty of. I want to imagine a world in which we're all persons who recognize the other as having experience of infinite value to them, and recognizing that in encountering them and in being in dialogue with them, it can sometimes help to oscillate between seeing them as subjects and objects. But again, I would love to hear more about that question. So maybe that person will be in the group later. I don't know, but anyway, thank you for that, that opportunity to try to clarify.
We have a question from Richard Merin asking, how could using the oscillating between visions without an algorithm could have led to a different end result in the case that led to the death of Joyce Echaquan. She's a First Nation person she died in very difficult circumstances, racism and so on. Yes. How would it have led to different behaviors?
All right, thank you for that question, which is of fundamental importance. I try to make clear up front that I don't have fantasies about having a system that's going to cure world problems or systemic oppression. I'm trying to offer one tool that I hope can be of use, but the premise of the tool is that all persons have experience that is of infinite value to them. So plainly, when you recognize the infinite value of the other's experience, you don't treat them. It just goes without saying that you don't treat them as this Indigenous person and so many others have been and are treated currently. Again, I wish I could hear more. These are such wonderful questions. I wish I could hear more. That's the thing about dialogue. It's supposed to go two ways. This is a limitation of the Zoom setup.
Indeed, it's a limitation of our Zoom setup, at least when we want to host a certain number of attendees. We need to
of course,
to
no. Of course,
so,
no. I entirely understand.
So I'm sorry for that.
No. I entirely understand.
There's also this notion of two-eye seeing, which is a piece of wisdom that comes from Canadian First Nations, at least the Mi'kmaq Nation, about seeing the world through the lenses of both past and current First Nations worldviews, as well as the more like Western Eurocentric worldview. And the idea proposed by those who are proponents of this two-eyed seeing is to be able to kind of oscillate, so to speak, between the two visions, or see the world through both visions, or two eyes, so to speak, two visions. I don't know if you want to comment on that. I know we don't want to keep you too long, and we're very close to the hour.
No. Thank you again for another just wonderful question. And I would like to hear more about two-eyed seeing. I'd like to hear, I mean, I'm always for oscillation. And you might ask, well, if you like the idea of oscillation, why did I pick binocular vision as opposed to two-eyed seeing, or as W.E.B. Du Bois said, double vision? I don't think the differences are terribly important. In the case of W.E.B. Du Bois, he didn't quite so much aspire to seeing two at once. I mean, maybe I'm being unfair here, but there's a way in which he was despairing of the way in which an unjust society requires someone to see in two ways, to oscillate between two ways. But perhaps the two-eyed seeing that you're describing, Erik, is not like, well, again, this is for part of a larger conversation, right? I would love to know more about how two-eyed seeing resembles W.E.B. Du Bois's double vision, and how it resembles what I'm trying to talk about when I talk about binocular vision. Again, thank you. That's a wonderful question.
All right, so we're now coming to the conclusion, and Simon will pick it up for this part. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Parens. It's very interesting. Our next conference will be presented on June 16 by Professor Marie-France Renaud, Directeur of Centre de recherche Léa Robach sur les inégalités sociales de santé de Montréal. The talk will be in French. Thank you again for your interest in this lecture series and for your questions. Erik, do you have something to add here?
I have a thank you.
Dr. Yeah.
Eric is just.
we have to Erik. No, yeah. You want to say something, Dr. Parens? Yeah.
Dr. Senghor, I want to thank you for organizing it. I want to thank Dr. Erik Racine for organizing it, and I want to thank everyone who took the time to show up for an hour when they could have been eating lunch all by themselves somewhere. So thank you very much. It was a lot of fun, and I'm only sorry that we didn't get a chance to have still more conversation. But thank you for the opportunity. It was a real honor.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Right.
Thank you. Merci tout le monde. Bye bye.
Merci. Bye.
So, Erik, I'll see you in a couple of hours.
Exactly.
Yeah.